little bit late. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first issue briefing of the annual meeting of New Champion 2017. Wonderful to see such a busy room, and thank you for finding your way to this forgotten corner of the Dalian International Convention Centre. I think we're hidden away in this corner for a reason, because we've got the most interesting sessions. It's kind of an outside-in session, as I see it. China, the world's next leader. We try to take some of the issues that really are being discussed and considered and dwelled upon in the international sphere a lot. And we have some amazing expertise in this building, in this room. Let's not talk about it. The purpose of these issue briefings is very, very simple. You'll be hearing very little of me. We only have 30 minutes, which is a very short amount of time to cover very important subjects. I encourage as little by way of opening remarks. We'll keep them very brief. I encourage as much interaction as possible. So I'd very much like you to stick your hand up whenever you have a question, whenever you have a comment. I very much encourage disagreement and discourse. Hopefully we'll have a fun and energetic 30 minutes. My name is Oliver Cann. I'm from the World Economic Forum. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this session. So, two speakers. I'm very honored to be joined by Professor Anne Florini, Professor of Public Policy, Academic Director, and a Master's in Tri-Sector Collaboration at the Singapore Management University in Singapore, and Li Daokui, the Dean of Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, here in the People's Republic of China. Professor Li, I was honored to be joined by you last year. We were talking about pollution, I remember, so very good to have you back. I'm going to start by a couple of quick questions just to get the session started. And my question to you is quite simple. We have a leadership vacuum in the world as perceived internationally and maybe within China. What is the situation with regards to China stepping up and becoming a global leader, as many people seem to expect it to be?
Okay, I have a simple metaphor for today's China in terms of global leadership. That is, China is a huge economy, huge country, right? However, it's not very skilled in playing the game. So my metaphor is China is like Yao Ming when he was 16 years old, 2 meters tall. However, the player as Yao Ming was not very skilled, was not well built up in playing the rough game. However, China is now willing to learn. China is now willing to adapt to the new game, to learn. And in this regard, China very quickly, China needs to build up three things, right? China is gradually learning. Number one, that is China needs to further beef up its economic power. And in this regard, China is already number one by far in terms of production of physical goods. Physical goods, cars, steel, cement, by far China is number one. And in addition, China has surplus in these goods, being able to use it in the One Belt, One Road. Second area China is now beefing up and trying to learn is soft skill. That is how to tell a good story about China's own success, how to distill good things from Chinese experience to share with other countries. And number three, the third area is also very, very interesting. We don't talk about it, but it's still very important. In order to be a global leader, you do have to have some kind of military capacity. Doesn't mean that you have to use it. Difference, right? You have the power, but you don't have to use it. Let's face it, as a global leader, you have to have this military power. So in these three regards, I think China is now gradually building up the muscle in order to become a true global leader.
Okay, it's a rough game, as you just mentioned, and I love the analogy, a 16-year-old, 2-meter-tall basketball player with so much potential to grow into. Give us a scorecard of those three areas: economic power, soft skills, military capacity. Give China a mark out of 5 for each of those three areas.
Well, I would say China perhaps out of 5, 4 in terms of economic power, especially considering that China has already become the largest producer of physical products, usually ranging between a quarter to 1/2 of global output. If you count goods by goods, okay? We don't have time to go through that, right? I give 4. I gave 2 or 3 in terms of building up soft skill, or ability to theorizing, ability in arguing, ability to telling stories. In that regard, education. My area, my university, my area are not doing as good as we should, right? Third area, of course, I give only 3, in terms of building military capacity. Again, let me emphasize, military capacity is different from exercising military power. 2 different things.
Fascinating, and lots to chew on there, and then we'll come back to these. But before we do, I'd like to bring in Professor Florini. You've written recently a book on China's political trajectory. You're currently focusing on the area of tri-sector collaboration, business, government, and civil society, with a particular focus, if I'm not mistaken, on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. These are big areas, of course. We had a historic speech by President Xi in Davos in January, where he asserted a willingness to play a greater role of leadership in the area of climate change. Give us your perspective on how far China is contributing towards leadership since January. I know it's early days.
That one's a little hard to answer. What's it done in the last 6 months? But I want to start by going back to Professor Li's point. Really interesting set of analogies about capacity. But of course, the analogy breaks down in that it was very clear what the game was that he had to learn how to play. It is not nearly so clear now what is the game that the world needs to have leadership in. There's a set of very broad goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate aspirations. But in terms of what specifically do we do, what agreements do we need, what instruments do we need? Do we need something like the institution building that we got in the post-war era when we had the American leadership of the world? Do we need a different kind of leadership? What's it for now? So yes, China needs to develop all these capacities, but it also is going to need a set of capacities around what's the business model for the future? What does a sustainable business sector actually look like? Where does finance take us? And here I can point to one very specific example where China's been doing some very interesting things, which is this notion of how do you reconfigure global finance such that it is actually supporting a transition to sustainability as opposed to this very unsustainable path that we're on. So with the UN Environment Program, other people have been looking around the world saying who's doing what in terms of changing the regulatory structures, changing what it is that finance is supposed to do. Turns out the People's Bank of China is one of the leading voices in rethinking how do you regulate the financial system such that it supports what humanity needs as opposed to what makes money for financiers in the short term.
Okay, so in terms of contribution, we're talking about capacity, and you're bringing into the discussion the institutions, and we have Belt and Road, we have the Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS Bank. So there are steps being taken there to build this new machinery for a new world order, for a multipolar world.
There are, but things like, okay, the One Belt, One Road, and this I'd very much like to hear what Professor Li thinks of this. That could be an extremely good thing for the world, it could be an extremely bad thing for the world. It entirely depends on how it's actually implemented. So yes, the idea that you're creating infrastructure into places that don't have it could bring about tremendous economic growth, could bring about a whole bunch of collapsed loans 10 years from now that have utterly failed. One area of concern that I have, particularly in the climate area, is right now there are plans for 100 coal-fired power plants as part of One Belt, One Road. Is this global leadership, or is this business as usual? And I think this is really the question that we need to grapple with, is what does it mean to be a leader in today's world? Does it mean just being the biggest power and setting the rules for everybody? Or does it mean having a sense of your own self-interest that is sufficiently enlightened that you are actually taking the world in a direction that serves everyone's interest, not only your national interest? The US, for all the problems with the way the US order was set up post-World War II, there are clearly cases where the US said, our enlightened self-interest is we allow a bunch of countries to discriminate against us in trade. We create infrastructure for others at our own expense. Is that what's going to be happening now?
And Professor Li, let's obviously hear your thoughts here. Let's go back to the 16-year-old, 2-meter high, strapping, promising, bursting full of energy basketball player. How is this infrastructure developing? Is it still naive? Is it fit for purpose, as Professor Florini just suggested? It might not be.
Well, the interesting thing about China being a global leader is that China is very much conscious of its limitations. China is very much conscious of the ability or need to learn. Take the One Belt, One Road initiative, for example, right? I do not think China has a clear blueprint in terms of how to implement this. Instead, the One Belt, One Road initiative is, in essence, a grassroots level project. That is, each country in the region would propose China what they want. Either they want a power plant or they want a road. And then Chinese counterparts, whether it's a business, private business, or state-owned company, would go there, would negotiate to see what kind of collaboration they can do. If they finally, after negotiation, then the leaders would go there and then do the fancy signature ceremony, right? So I think the beauty of the One Belt, One Road is not conceptual, it's not top-down, rather than it's bottom-up. Therefore, the One Belt, One Road projects are actually tailoring to the needs of the local people most. Instead of saying, oh, we need a power wind, we need a windmill, we need a hydraulic, or we don't need a hydraulic. So do it from the grassroots level, touch the people. Do it this way would actually implies inclusiveness, because local people are involved. The livelihood of local people is improved.
But if local people involves, if improving the livelihoods of local people involves also coal-fired power stations, for example, that's an own goal.
Well, I do believe that in many parts of the world, the #1 job for them is to be able to feed themselves when they wake up in the morning, to be able to get basic heating in the winter, to be able to get basic air conditioning in hospitals for those injured and frail people, right? Instead of talking about fancy terms of cutting down carbon. Yes, cutting down carbon is super important for regions in China, for regions in the US and Europe. But for these regions, we first have to improve the basic living of the people. Let them first use coal-fired power. We cut down here in China. Let's use more wind. Let them use coal-fired power. I believe that's progress, right? Rather than imposing a uniform standard on everybody.
I want to push back on that a little bit, because I agree with you that you should not impose a uniform standard on anybody, and development approaches until recently have been much too much of that kind of approach. So the idea that it is bottom-up and self-generated makes perfect sense. But there's also a role for intellectual leadership and working with countries and helping them understand that there are better ways of doing things. I think there are very, very few cases where coal makes sense for anybody anymore, and that governments may be coming back to you and saying, let's build coal, because that's what they know. It's not because it's what's actually in their own interest. One of the things that makes a great deal of sense for any countries trying to play global leadership roles is to be thinking not only about how do we work with other countries in a way that is inclusive, which I entirely agree with you is the way we should be doing things, but it is also very much how do we enlighten everyone's self-interest, and what is it out of our own experiences? What China has accomplished in going green in the last few years is extraordinary. Make that available to the world. That, I think, is where one form of global leadership that is an extraordinarily important thing for China to do. China has gone, I think, well past the point, at this point, of saying, we've done what we've done in China, this is extraordinarily impressive, we're starting to go out. I think China's beyond that point. I think China has an extraordinary story to tell in this issue area and should be pushing it.
I certainly would not disagree. However, I also want to emphasize development is a process which has to be based upon individual communities, has to benefit local communities.
Absolutely.
We have to understand what they really, really want. Here we're talking about regions or communities with only life expectancy only 40 years.
Right.
For them, the most important thing is to be able to live extra 5 years. To them, the secondary priority is cutting down carbon consumption.
And it's wonderful to have this dissent. We can revisit. We're halfway through. Can you believe we're halfway through this session already?
Yeah.
So let's have a quick show of hands. If you've got questions, make them as edgy as you like. If you've got comments, please keep them brief. Who wants the microphone first? Gentleman here in the second row. And after that, the gentleman here in the first. Could you just remind us where you're from, your name, please?
Yes, Greg Engel, University of Chicago. Professor Li, I was very much struck that you didn't mention innovation. It seems like China has been making dramatic progress in its universities and its scientific endeavors, engineering. but most of the intellectual property I see coming out of China may be a bit more incremental. What is the educational structure that's being put in place for formative discovery to provide intellectual leadership to the science and technology community?
So before we answer that, let's just have the second question here from the gentleman in the first row.
It's not a question from me, but it's comments on top of what your discussion. Just one example, I just came back from Vietnam, for example. During those kind of growth or interaction between China and Vietnam, for example, Vietnam government learned a lot from what's happening in China in the last 20, 30 years. For example, they have pretty high standard for emission, wastewater treatment, etc. So a lot of Chinese companies go there and make huge investment over there, follow the latest legislation, which then bring not just economic, but also more sustainable, more environmental friendly production over there. So that is sort of a good example how China could help the global or those countries go towards more sustainable growth.
So we are seeing good levels of leadership from China in helping countries move up the value chain and create more sustainable societies. Okay, let's go to innovation, Professor Li.
Innovation in many areas in China is actually making good progress without much recognition from people outside China. Thank you for mentioning that, okay? Many people don't know that actually outside China, right? Now, I would argue that the areas in which China has been making good progress in innovation mainly is in the area of engineering and applied sciences, because in China we do have, to some extent, I argue, good tradition from the Soviet era. So engineering education, I think, is far better than education of social sciences and including economics. So we do have wonderful engineers every year, 1 million of them coming out of college. Each of them can be ready to become engineer working for a company. Plus, we have a large market. Therefore, in internet and in material science and in construction equipment, right? China is quickly catching up. In some areas, it is leading. Now, what China is missing in innovation, I think, is in basic science. It takes time. It takes time to accumulate research in basic science. And the second, innovation in social sciences, right? We are really lacking people who can come to Davos, the summer Davos, to talk, to explain what's going on in China, to tell a China story. So that area, I think we are far lagging behind UK and the US. We have to learn. And I think most people are very conscious of this in China.
As a relatively active watcher of China from outside, I think this story is changing. I mean, the acknowledgement of the number of patents filed, for example, the Huawei and ZTE are the two leading individual patent filers, etc. But I think that where we lack knowledge is the nuance. So it's where the patents are, the quality of these patents, and how they're filtering down into broad-based economic growth and innovation, which affects people's lives. But let's quickly move on. This lady here, second row, please let us know who you are and give us your question.
Lynn Kwok. I'm at the Center for International Law in Singapore, as well as in Brookings Institution in the United States. My question for you is, so in this vision of China as the next world leader, how could you identify a couple of areas where you think China would be different as world leader, say, from the United States? So in the realm of security or economics, how would Chinese leadership differ from US leadership? Thank you.
Okay.
Let's ask the American.
It will have to differ in a couple of ways because the nature of the world has changed. Becoming a world leader is, people seem to want to do it, and I think it's very similar to other situations where you find yourself in a leadership position and then you start wondering, why did I want to be here? Because what leadership really is about paying the costs for everybody else so that the world as a whole can move forward. When the US created the post-World War II order, it was a much simpler world. There were much easier trade issues, economic issues in general. There was much less of a sense of anything as complex as the Sustainable Development Goals was beyond imagining at that point. Even militarily, things were much easier to understand. And the cost of acquiring that kind of capacity was more manageable, I think, than it is now. So I think it's harder. The approach that has to be taken is also quite different. we're moving out of a state-centric world where you basically get the governments together and that's how you solve problems. And now we're going into a world, as we've seen with the Paris Climate Accord, this very bottom-up approach. Massively time-consuming, takes a deep understanding of business, takes a deep understanding of civil society and social organization. And so those are all ways in which, if there is going to be a single world leader, which I actually very much doubt, those are all things that that leader is going to be responsible for.
Very quickly, if I understand, what the question is, what's difference down from now on between the Chinese leadership and the US leadership? I think two things, right? First, it's obvious that Chinese leadership will continue to be international, more than willing to come to forward like this, Chinese premier or president. Whereas the US president, I think, will be increasingly reluctant to come to international, multilateral venue like this, right? More domestic focus. Second, the American leadership, I guess, will continue to be very, very popular in the sense that reacting quickly through social media to events, quick events, small events, and popular events, where the Chinese leaders will stay away from reacting to very quick issues, social issues, rather stay on principles, stating principles. That's the difference.
For the next 4 years.
Correct. We don't know what will happen in the US after 5 years.
That's right.
It's changing so fast.
But that's a good question. Is there a sense within China that this is an opportunity bestowed upon China by political events in the US and a president that wants to look inward rather than outward, and that this opportunity, this window of opportunity, could close in 4 years or 8 years?
That's true. I think you're definitely right. However, in Chinese we say every opportunity also implies a potential pitfall. So China, I think, is unlikely to fall in the pitfall, in that China is unlikely to be overly stretched in doing things that China is not familiar with.
5 minutes to go. 2 more questions. Okay, lady here in the second row, and then could we get a microphone over to the lady there at the back, please?
你好，我想请问一下李教授。
Professor Li, I'm from the TV station of
对于很
I'm a journalist from the TV station in Jiangsu province. For most of the Chinese, they could also invest in the world, mostly in properties all over the world. So the heat of investing in the properties is still very hot. But after several rounds of macro control, it seems that it is going down a little bit. So do you think it is already a downturn cycle for the property market, and what kind of policy adjustment will there be?
Good question, madam.
Yes, Ying Chen from University of Hong Kong. Professor Li, you gave China 2 out of 3 on soft power. Is that a bit too generous? And then the question then is, what would be you recommend for China to boost its soft power? And for Professor Lauren too.
It may be also helpful to have your interpretation, but Professor Li, the question was directed at you. Give us your thoughts on that one.
Okay, very, very quickly, since the forum, this session is not about the property market in China. Let me say that the property market in China is likely to go through a transition from a uniform and bull market to very, very structured and fractured markets. Some markets will be strong, some markets will be weak, and there will be a consolidation of property developers in China. Okay, on the second question, you said I was overly generous. I see your point. I see your point, but still I stick to my grade 2. I think the single most important area for China to improve in this area is to not be shy. So far, Chinese intellectuals and scholars oftentimes feel a little bit ashamed. They feel what we have been doing in China are wrong. We're not doing things correct. Even though we've got 40 years of rapid growth, but next year, 2018, will be the 40th anniversary of fast growth. 40 years for a large country, so something must be right. But instead, our scholars always feel very, very, very diffident, right? Very, very cautious. So that's the so the build up confidence as a basketball player. Yao Ming, when he was 16 years old, is one of the most important areas for him to improve.
And there could be a perception difference here, because maybe our view from outside China is slightly different. Maybe Min would have been spotted by scouts from the NBA whilst he was going through school. Professor Florini, what do you think?
Yeah, I think certainly the perspective from outside of China is that China is a very confident nation with an immense sense of dynamism and excitement here. So I think the inside and outside perspectives are very different. In terms of soft power and who actually has what, I think we're seeing a very rapid experiment in the United States about how rapidly can you destroy your soft power, which I think is rather unfortunate. But at the same time, we're also seeing the parts of the US system that are very strong speaking out against that to some degree, with this rise of civil society and the states taking on a very much more powerful role. I think the soft power of the US and the soft power of China are playing out in entirely different fields. It is not about one central government versus another central government anymore.
And I just want to point out, you've been very successful in talking Professor Li down. He said 2 to 3, and when he repeated the question, it was 2. So you've already brought down you've talked down China's soft power and with the power of one question. 2 minutes left. Most immediate challenges that you believe China faces on its road to getting straight 5s, Professor Li. What does China need to do? What are the most urgent challenges it needs to address? We've talked about a few of them.
Well, I believe confidence or capacity can only be built through solving critical problems. When you solve problems, or like winning a big game, will give you confidence. Currently, there are many international affairs, especially issues. North Korea.
So what is the big game? North Korea? North Korea. Yeah, okay. North Korea more than Paris, more than free regional trade?
More urgent.
Okay.
It's a test of capacity.
Fascinating.
If you solve North Korea, the entire world will be very grateful.
In collaboration with many other countries.
But I think Paris is the other one. And if the US isn't going to be pushing and leading that agenda, somebody has to make sure that the next rounds of negotiations in 2020, we do have this ambitious vamping up of the targets. And we'll see whether China does that.
And in 2 seconds, we will have reached our 30 minutes. I can't believe it's gone so fast. Thank you so much for joining us. I've found this fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience watching live online.
Very nice to meet you.